Today we have a very special guest, Tombos from GTO Wizard. If you've seen any of Tom's webinars or interacted with him on poker forums, then you know that Tom has an excellent understanding of poker theory. So I thought it would be a good idea to test that understanding by coming up with a poker theory quiz.
In return, I've come up with a separate quiz for QY. And just to make things more fun, we've both agreed to make the questions as difficult and tricky as possible. This video will feature me attempting QY's quiz, but you can watch QY attempt my quiz on the GTO Wizard channel.
Are you ready for the hardest quiz you've ever done?
Let's do it.
Okay, so question number 1. Button open versus big blind call, as I'm sure you are aware of. On boards like Ace King 6, big bets get used a lot. And one of the main reasons why this happens is because button has a big nut advantage. So what do you think is going to happen if we remove all of the 2-pair plus from button's range, such that the nut advantage is a little bit more equalized? So A, is the frequency going to be similar and the bet size smaller, or B, similar bet size but lower frequency?
Ooh, this is a fun question. So normally in these spots, the solver just wants to overbet or check. And I've always said, and I've always preached that bet sizing is dictated by the nut advantage, but you're removing that nut advantage. So intuitively, I would think the bet size goes down, which is why I guess A, but hold on a sec, hold on. Let me think this through, because there's another thing that happens on ace king boards, and that is your incentive to bet small with hands like second pair, for example, decreases because you're not folding out overcards. It's a really interesting question because it's like, which of these incentives becomes more important? I'm going to go with B, similar bet size. I think it'll still choose an overbet with some of the remaining strong, like top pair kind of hands, and just decrease the frequency significantly. So final answer, B.
B is the correct answer. I'm really impressed. So here we have the original sim. So just standard button versus big blind ranges. I've given it like 4 different sizes, and you can see it always uses the biggest one. And what I've done in this other sim is remove all of the 2-pair plus from the buttons range. And as you correctly predicted, the only change is that the sizing, the frequency goes down. The sizing still stays the same. It still wants to play over bet or check, and your logic was spot on as well. This is a board where it just doesn't make much sense to bet small because there's no hand that really wants to bet smaller, right? Like if you were to have a small bet, the only reason to do this would be to be able to bet some of these like King X hands that have around like 60, 70 something percent equity. But you know, these hands, what do they really gain from betting, right? They're not really denying any amount of equity. All these hands that are folding, they're pretty much drawing dead against King X. So rule of thumb is that if you're not betting any marginal hands, you should really be choosing a bigger bet size because your betting range is more polarized. So all of these ace queen, ace jack hands, they have like healthy enough equity, you know, with like 80 something percent equity. You definitely want to be going for a pretty big size. Probably it's okay to even make like a small overbet, but of course the frequency goes down because you're missing like all this ace king and pocket kings, right? Sixes that want to going big. Yeah, so definitely, you know, if we like threw in more bet sizes, I would expect to see like a small decrease in the bet size, but it would not be like the main difference would still be the frequency, right? We're not expect to see a huge difference in bet size just because we still have like a big region of hands that want to be betting big, and we just don't have like any hands at all that want to bet small.
Great answer. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Question number 2. In the nuts or error situation on the river, our nut hands typically want to go all in. But when would you say it's important to size down? A, our range lacks bluffs. B, our nut hands block villains calling range. C, all of the above. Or D, none of the above.
Okay. So typically in a nuts or error situation, yeah, you just want to shove on the river or bet geometrically on earlier streets in order to shove on the river. So a clarification here, do we block all of villain's calling range or just part of it?
Not all, just part of it.
Okay. So I can immediately rule out A, because if you lack bluffs, then you just claim the full pot. Now, if you give this to a solver, it'll do crazy stuff like checking back the nuts, because it can like just claim the full pot either way. So there are multiple equilibria, blah, blah, blah. But that's a dominated strategy. So I'm going to rule out A immediately. Now, B, we block part of villain's calling range. But it's still a nuts or error situation. So I feel like you would have to change the ratio of value bets to bluffs you use, but the sizing would stay the same. So I think I'm going to go with D. Final answer.
Okay, I'm glad that I got you this time.
Oh, no.
You're right about A for sure. Right? Like, even if we lack bluffs, definitely we just still want to, like, wouldn't be a mistake to go all in. B is, it actually can be a reason for sizing down, and it kind of surprised me as well when I first saw it. Let me pull up like a simple toy game
Okay.
that I ran, right, just to prove that B is a potential reason to size down as well. Right, so the board is ace high, ace four, 3 deuce 4, and then out of position has a perfectly polarized range, just aces and then some pair hands. Whereas in position, I mean, these are all bluff catchers, right? He has like ace king, and then he has a bunch of king queen as well. They're all pure bluff catchers in the sense that they lose to aces and they beat was it 6, 7? Yeah, they beat all of out of positions error. So SPR is 10.
Okay.
There's 100 in the pot, 1K behind. I've given it a bunch of different sizes here, and when you run the tree, you actually see something quite surprising, which is that aces wants to go for the 2x pot size bet instead of just jamming for 10x pot, which is what you wouldn't normally expect, right? Like, usually in the nuts or error situation, like, the way to maximize your EV is just to go all in. And you are right in the sense that, let's say if we were to remove king queen, so now, we still block like a ton of impositions calling range, right? Because his only bluff catcher is ace king, and now aces wants to go all in. Isn't it kind of...
This is quite an interesting toy game.
Yeah, like I said, I'm not like 100% clear about what's going on here, but to me it has something to do with, like when you add in king queen here.
Yep.
And then you look at the EV of your various options, right? You can see there's a certain point where our EV is like maximum, right? Like, we want to bet 2x pot specifically. Any bigger is going to go down, right? Any smaller is obviously going to go down as well.
Yeah. So we can we see how they respond to this bet? I'm just curious.
I think this is just like the sweet spot where, because you block like so much of the ace king, right? You don't want to create a situation where you just ship it in and your opponent does not have to call with king queen at all. Right? It's just a little bit more efficient to pick a size that can force them to call with some king queen.
This makes sense, because when they have both of these in range, then when they hold ace king, they know that you're much more likely to have a bluff. But when they hold king queen, they don't remove those bluffs, and they have a much tougher decision. I feel like there's going to be a difference in the information levels when both of these are in their range compared to if just one's in their range. Like, for example, if you get rid of ace king, then obviously it's going to shove. If you get rid of king queen, it shoves. But when they have both, then there's like an information asymmetry depending on what they hold.
Yeah, in a normal situation, bigger bets always make more money because, even though your opponent calls less often, the times that he does call, you just make so much more money. But in this situation, it's not only about the calling frequency. Right? It's also about the types of hands you can get him to call with. Right? If you can actually get him to call like a smaller bet, right? But call with hands that you don't actually block, right, then it could still overall be a better strategy than using a bigger size, getting to call with like a tighter range, right? But only with hands that that you heavily block. Okay, so question number 3. So for button versus big blind, so this one is button versus big blind as well. Board is king 7 deuce rainbow. You might have noticed that we like to go for really small check raise size. So would you say this is happening because the board is really dry and the button has no draws? Or do you think it's happening because it's important to check raise hands like 7x?
Ooh, that's a difficult question. So I think that obviously on king 7-2, button is going to be doing something close to a range bet with a small size, right? And if the board is more draw heavy, then they have more hands to choose from when facing a check raise. Or put another way, the value of fold equity is a bit lower on, for example, king 7-2 two-tone compared to rainbow. And so I think the lack of draws forces them to call like a lot of high card stuff. And because of that, like 7x, like if you check raise second pair here, it's actually like a value check raise. And I think you'd want to check raise 7x more so in this case. So I feel like both of these play into the correct answer somehow. Maybe I'm missing something, but I feel like it's important to check raise hands like second pair here. And I feel like the lack of draws incentivizes you to do that more. But if I had to choose one of these answers, I would go with B. It's important to check raise hands like 7x.
Yeah, B is my preferred answer as well. Okay, so first of all, you can see if you give big blind the option of like a 3x and a 4x raise, it always chooses the smaller size. And again, to most people, or at first glance, like it seems that we're just going for the small size because it's really difficult for in position to be defending against such a small raise because he's betting entire range from the flop. So he needs to be defending like most of it versus a small enough check raise, including hands like 10-9 and Jack-10 offsuit. So on one hand, you can argue that the smaller raise is more effective. But the reason why I don't think it's like that accurate of an interpretation, right, is, what do you think is going to happen if we just remove like all of the 7x and deuce x from the big blinds range? Do you think we're still going to go for a
no
check raise?
Because you're removing the mergey check raises, and those are what are driving the sizing here. You'd be forced to use a more polar strategy in that case, I think.
Yeah, exactly. It's quite similar to the first question, the one with the ace king high board.
Yep.
If you're not like betting any marginal hands like king x or pocket queens or on an ace king high board, then there's just no reason to be betting small. So kind of a similar situation over here where we're just using the small size because of all these reasons that you mentioned, right? 7x is really interested in betting, right? Because our opponent's range is so wide and it's going to have like pretty good equity when called. Right? In fact, we don't even care that much if our opponent folds like all these, queen highs and ace highs, right? If he wants to float these hands, then we're just getting thin value. If he wants to fold those hands, then we still deny quite a bit of equity against them. So it's a win-win situation for us in a way. And to me, that's what drives the smaller size, right? In fact, we can do like a little experiment. Let's not lock all of these one pair hands to check all the time. And if we've done it correctly, we should see the solver prefer to use a bigger size. So yeah, so when we force like all of these one pair hands to call, you can see the solver will just prefer going for the bigger size. And again, this is in spite of the fact that the in position player does not have like so many difficult defense versus a big size, right? This is the response versus small size. As we've seen, he needs to call stuff like Jack-10 and 10-9, right, versus the bigger size. I imagine there's quite a lot less of this sort of stuff, right? Lower frequency at least, right? So it's easier to play, definitely easier to play against the bigger size. But like you said, the solver does not have any conception in terms of like what's an easy or difficult strategy to execute, right? So we still go for the bigger size overall.
Yeah, you had mentioned in this question, like the choice was between you're not charging draws and 7x wants to raise. And I was humming and hawing about the difference between a two-tone and rainbow board. But when you said, what would happen if we didn't have, sevens, second or third pair here, then it's just very obvious that a large size would make sense. And that's why B is probably a much better answer than A. So yeah, really nice demonstration on this one.
So question number 4. On the river, how should our bet sizing change with a 7 deuce bounty in play? So for the members of the audience who've never heard of this is just something that happens a lot in like live games where you get an additional bounty from every single player if you do happen to win a hand with 7 deuce. And it doesn't matter how you win it. You can, even if you bet your opponent folds, you get the bounty. If somehow you bet and your opponent calls and you have the best hand, you win the bounty as well. Right? But for this specific question, we have 7 deuce would be just like a pure bluff. So how do you think the presence of this bounty would affect our bet sizing?
Hitting me with the fun questions today. Oh, this is such an interesting one. So we're assuming 7-2 is a bluff and that we have these bluffs in play. So instinctively, I want to say your range is going to be more polarized and therefore sizing increases. But let me think a little more, because if our opponent folds to our bluff, they don't just lose the pot. They have to actually pay us a bounty. So you've actually changed the value of folding. So let's imagine that a fold is now worth like -5 instead of 0. And you want to make them indifferent between a -5 EV call or whatever it happens to be and a -5 EV fold. So in that case, you can either change your bluff to value ratio or increase your sizing to give them worse odds, and both accomplish the same thing. So again, I want to say A, it increases. What am I missing here?
So
no, that's my final answer. I'm locking it in. I'm locking it in. Hey.
That would be my answer as well. Now, to be honest, I didn't consider the fact that folding is now potentially minus EV. My interpretation was with this bounty in play, your opponent, he's going to have to call like wider. In situations where he's supposed to call MDF, he's going to have to call like more than MDF. Because if he only calls MDF, then you would just bluff with 7 deuce all the time, because giving up is 0 EV and then bluffing is actually plus EV. Yeah. So the way that I would approach this question is that given that your opponent has to call more than MDF for a certain bet size, that would just allow you to size up with certain hands. Maybe if you have a hand that was originally worth like a pot size bet on the river, and the reason why the hand is worth a pot size bet is because that's like the optimal size to bet, in the sense that you extract the most value and you have like the ideal equity when called, without like isolating yourself against too many better hands. Right? But now that your opponent is going to call like a little bit more versus the same size, it makes sense for every single hand in your range to be sizing up a touch, right? Just because you can have the same equity when called by going for that bigger size. So there would be no reason not to size up a touch. Does that make sense?
That does, yeah.
Yeah, well done. So three out of 4 for now. So you basically passed the quiz already, right? But let's
I didn't flunk, UI. I didn't flunk.
Okay, last question. So this one isn't really bet sizing related, but I just wanted to include it because I thought it was like pretty cool. Right? So on flush completing rivers, obviously we prefer to bluff with the flush blocker in most situations, right? But let's say if we remove all flushes from our opponent's range, like how valuable do you think the flush blocker is going to be now? So A, we still prefer to bluff with the flush blocker. B, maybe the flush blocker actually becomes bad to bluff, right? Or C, it doesn't matter whether we have the blocker or not.
Ooh, that's a difficult question. So I like immediately you would think that if you're removing the hands that you're trying to block, then you would prefer to block without the flush blocker. But there's another factor that I think a lot of people don't consider with blockers, and that is we often think of it offensively, like I want to remove these combos from my opponent's range. But in the world of solvers, oftentimes blockers come down to disguising your own range. So using similar blockers in both your bluff and your value so that your opponent can't make, clairvoyant decisions against you. So I assume that we're going to be betting, even shoving a lot with our flushes. And I think in order to make sure that your opponent doesn't just have like clairvoyant calls against you, you need to include a number of flush blockers in your own range as bluffs. So you would still prefer to bluff with some flush blockers. Otherwise, the one spade hands in your opponent's range know that they only block value and not bluffs.
So Aiden?
It's so, I feel like it's going to depend on the spot, but I'm going with A. We still prefer to bluff with the flush blocker at least a decent portion of the time to disguise our own frequencies.
Final answer?
Final answer.
Yeah, that is in fact correct.
Yes!
Yeah, it's basically about preventing your opponent from like exploiting you by calling with hands that have good blockers and then just folding the hands with bad blockers.
Yeah.
I think about it as trying to make the EV distribution of your opponent's bluffs more even. If possible, you want to make the EV of every single bluff catcher in his range 0, instead of giving him like some region of really high EV bluff catchers and some like negative EV bluff catchers, because then he could just exploit you by like only betting the plus EV ones. Right? And the way to do that in this situation is just to make sure that your bluffing range shares cards with your value range. So we can do like a really cool experiment. So I'm going to tweak the ranges a little bit. I want to remove all flushes from big blind's range. Yeah. So basically you would think that having the diamond would be a lot less valuable now, right? Since you don't really block as many of your opponent's nut hands, right? But it turns out we still very much prefer to bluff with hands like, Jack 9 with a diamond. You can see it's bluffing like all the time, and then we're just giving up the combos without the diamond. Right? Similar thing that's going on for hands like King 9 as well. And the reason is exactly what you mentioned. Yeah, it kind of reminds me of something you said in like a separate webinar also. The one about how something is GTO is or rather how to figure out like why we do the thing is to ask yourself the question like, what can my opponent do if I don't do the thing? So this case would clearly be pretty bad to let's say if we were to do the opposite. Right? We just like bluff with non-diamond hands and then we just give up with all of our one diamond hands. Our opponent would have like a super easy strategy of just like calling down all the time with like queen jack with a diamond and then just folding all the time without the diamond, because if he has like queen jack with no diamond, for example, he's going to be blocking like a ton of bluffs, right? And there'll be absolutely no reason for him to call down that hand. And this adjustment would gain a ton of EV because the one diamond hands would have like so much EV as a bluff catch. So what we're really trying to do is to like decrease the EV of some of our opponent's best bluff catches. Like currently, queen jack with a diamond is a pretty good bluff catcher because it blocks a whole bunch of our value range. So we want to decrease its EV by bluffing some jack of diamond hands as well. Right? And by decreasing our opponent's EV, we're just increasing the EV of our own range since poker is a zero-sum game. Yep. So really not surprising that we much prefer to bluff hands with a diamond.
Excellent
Well
question.
done. 4 out of 5. I'm really.
I'll take it.
impressed,
I'll
to be
take
honest.
it. Hey, I've got a pretty tricky quiz lined up for you too. So
This is so